for inviting me to talk to you guys today about a little bit about the research that I've done. This presentation is going to skew very heavily to stuff that's just getting started or stuff that I want to do, so you have to excuse that there's not a lot of hard data. There's more questions and hand-waving sort of things. So the distributional responses of fish to climate change has been fairly well modeled, fairly well documented. This is just one of many potential studies I could have pulled off of out of the literature, documenting range shifts of fish species in the North Sea in response to changing, elevating mean winter bottom temperatures. The one thing that all these studies tend to have in common is that they treat the fish that they're working with as a homogeneous unit, that the fish are dealt with as all being alike, and that there's no underlying population structure within these species. And by and large, we know that that's not the case. In freshwater systems, this is a picture of a freshwater larval freshwater fish. We know that populations of freshwater fishes tend to be structured by the river basins that they're found in. Fish in the Brazos River will be different from those in the Colorado because you don't have individuals packing up their bags and hitting I-10 to cross to the next river. But even within a river system, within the watersheds within a river system, or along an upstream-downstream gradient, you'll often see structuring of populations, that individuals upstream are genetically or somehow different from individuals further downstream. That's not been the case in the marine environment, where traditionally the marine fish populations have been viewed as being open. That marine fish spawn, they produce these larval stages that remain in the plankton for up to a couple of months at a time, and that they form this larval pool that just sort of recruit to wherever they find suitable habitat. Now, this traditional view is being challenged in the literature quite heavily in that there seems to be a lot of these local populations that exhibit self-recruitment. They produce these larval fish that somehow find their way back home. And this opens up all sorts of interesting possibilities for what might be going on in the marine environment. And the question just kind of comes down to how far down the rabbit hole we want to go, or do we need to go, in order to accurately predict how fish are going to respond to climate change. This study here by Anderson et al. In 2005 dealt with the European mountain hares, and they took a metapopulation model they had for this species in Great Britain and welded it onto a spatially explicit climate model. And they found that depending on how they parameterized the model in terms of dispersal between population units within Great Britain, they would see dramatically different responses in different parts of the range of this rabbit to climate change. Okay, but again, they are treating these rabbits in the model as all homogeneous individuals. And we know that all fish are not created equal. We know that there's a great deal of individual variation within a population, okay, or within a stock or within a species. Everything from growth rate to the age of maturation, fecundity, to color patterns and behavior and morphology. If this is randomly distributed through the population, through the species or the stock, that's great. That's a robust stock that's going to be very resilient in the face of environmental changes. However, what's more common is that it's not randomly distributed within the population, and that opens up a whole new can of worms. And how do we deal with these populations, these units that are not the same? I first got interested in this subject when I was kind of an Uber postdoc in Iceland. The position I had doesn't have an English equivalent. But the Icelandic cod stock, the population of cod around the island of Iceland, is currently viewed and managed as a single unit, a single population unit. However, work that was done before I got there and work that I did really clarified that there is a geographical split in the population between North Iceland and South Iceland that are physiologically different from one another. On top of that, within each of these geographical splits in the population, we have behavioral morphs. We have a group of cod that are called frontal cod that hop off the continental shelf and go make these dramatic vertical migrations through the water column every day. And then we have our couch potatoes here that sit on the continental shelf, feasting on shrimp and capelin all the time. And the research that we did documented that not only do these guys differ in their behavior, they differ in their morphology and their physiology and their energy storage and their diet and all these things. But they're being treated for management purposes as a single population unit. And the problem is that they differ in their resiliency to disturbance, such as fishing. And though we are moving in that direction, we haven't gotten there yet in terms of looking at how climate influences these factors. It is something that's likely to play a role in how Icelandic cod stock is going to respond to perturbations driven by climate change. We don't have to go as far as Iceland, though, to really see the potential of this sort of thing taking hold in how we view fish management and conservation. In the state of Texas, these two maps are really the driving force predicting the future of fish populations, whether they be freshwater fish, coastal fish, or estuarine fishes here in the state of Texas. On the left, on your left, we have the map of current mean annual precipitation, and there's a very strong east to west gradient in precipitation in the state. On the right here, we have the projected population growth over the next 50 years for the state of Texas. And here we have that I-35 corridor from Dallas-Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio, down to Laredo. And what this boils down to is that even without climate change, there's not enough water for the state of Texas. Okay. For all the demands that are placed on the water resources in this state, there's just simply not enough water. So my question is, given that already we have a strong gradient of rainfall, potential isolation and stuff and other factors, how do we go about managing different issues of related to fish here in the state of Texas? Oops, that's the wrong direction. There we go. Okay, this is a study that I'm running in the pilot stages right now. We're interested in looking at how estuarine-dependent fishes here in the state of Texas, how local adaptation to the individual bay systems that they're found in influences their demographic connectivity and ultimately their response to climate change. So we're interested in looking at 4 species: red drum, southern flounder, spotted sea trout, and Gulf killifish. And there's a nice gradient here in the species in their degree of estuarine dependence. Red drum is only in the estuary as juveniles. The larvae recruit in, are there for a couple of years, they move back offshore. These fish probably have the least amount of population structure. At the other end of the scale, we have a Gulf killifish, which is a very small fish, also known as mud minnows if you're down the coast. And these guys probably have very local populations, spend their entire lives within a very small area within the estuary, and probably have a very high, very fine scale population structure and a higher potential for local adaptation. We have a nice salinity and temperature gradient up and down along the coast already in place, and that's only going to become more pronounced as freshwater inflows to the bays become more and more reduced. And so come this winter, we're going to be going down to the coast and collecting a bunch of Gulf killifish and starting some common garden experiments, just document the amount of local adaptation occurring so that we can start parameterizing some models. The other projects that we have ongoing in my lab, and I have to acknowledge my collaborator, Allison Peace, there in the back, and my student Jessica Peace, unrelated, over here on the left. But we have a project ongoing looking at Guadalupe bass throughout the Colorado River drainage. Guadalupe bass is our freshwater state fish. It's endemic to the hill country of Texas. And I like this quote from a colleague of mine that I work with at Parks and Wildlife. These guys are not the biggest fish that you go out and catch. They won't put up the biggest fight or anything like that, but they're special because you have to go somewhere special to catch them. You have to go to these more or less pristine hill country streams, kayak or canoe, or float your way down there, and it's just a wonderful experience to go out and catch these things. The unfortunate thing is that if you recall the map of population growth in Texas, those bright red areas overlap almost completely with Guadalupe bass range. And these fish live in the streams that are currently providing or require flow from the Edwards Aquifer or flow from other sources that are also in high demand for San Antonio and the city of Austin and all the communities in between. So we have a couple of ongoing questions and studies with Guadalupe bass. Recently graduated a student that looked at the growth patterns of this fish using the scales, and we were interested in how Guadalupe bass growth responded to drought conditions in the South Llano River. South Llano River is a spring-fed system. It maintained its flow throughout the entire drought and still is flowing fairly well. Even so, we saw a dramatic decline with the increasing proportion of low flow observations, a dramatic decline in the annual growth rate of this fish. I have a student coming on this winter who is going to hopefully get out and catch fish from the North Llano, which didn't fare quite so well in the drought. It went dry, was reduced to a series of stagnant pools. We'll get some Guadalupe bass that survived through the drought, take a look at their growth patterns and see if there's differences in the response to these drought conditions based on stream type. And then hopefully run a laboratory study to sort of simulate the common garden sort of condition where we expose the fish in the continuously flowing river to conditions that would be similar to a stagnant river and vice versa. And then the other part of the question is we're looking at a much larger scale throughout the entire Colorado River drainage. We were interested in how Guadalupe bass populations have changed over the last 30 to 35 years. Back in the 70s, there was a PhD student at UT that made a tremendous collection of Guadalupe bass and deposited them in a museum in Austin. And so we're revisiting his sites and collecting Guadalupe bass and all the environmental data that we can for these sites and looking to see how the populations have changed. Are they morphologically different? Are they growing different in response to changed conditions? In the hopes that we can use any observed differences among these populations to improve the management and conservation strategies for this species. Ultimately, when all the models sort of indicate that, the coarse scale models indicate that Guadalupe bass are kind of in a tough spot for the next 50 to 100 years in terms of environmental conditions. However, if there are populations that are more tolerant to higher temperatures or lower flows or things like that, then we can start talking about selective stocking and other potential strategies. So with that, I think I did it in 10 minutes. Whew. If you got any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you very much for having me.
This is maybe a silly question, but in the public's perception, we're talking about that of fish. I think you have people who are fishermen, but you also have these sort of sometimes these science fiction types of things where, like I know in Maryland, where I'm from, when the snakehead fish came in, and these, they were supposed to be able to live on land.
Yeah, the frankenfish.
Frankenfish, and so there's and I think in general the sense that with deterioration of the environment, that which will survive is going to be nasty, brutish, and ugly as can be. I mean, and that may be, and we do. I know from some fish, the trash fish, the game fish. There's all kinds of different classifications that are not biological classifications, but the narrative that people apply to these things. So I mean, is that sort of a safe bet that it's just going to get uglier out there?
I don't know about uglier. It will get to be. There's a lot of native. The thing to bear in mind is that using the Guadalupe bass in the hill country as an example, a lot of endemic species on the hill country that have evolved in response to these conditions of drought and replenishment. They have physiological and behavioral strategies to cope with that to some extent. When you start pushing things kind of beyond that experience, then you start getting into fish that have life histories that are more capable of surviving that sort of thing. So you start seeing fish that maybe are not as long lived, do not reach these sorts of body sizes. So you tend to see a reduced community of fish in these systems. On top of which you open yourself up to invasive species and non-native species coming in and filling these niches that are either left empty or sort of reduced by these changes in the environmental conditions in the system. Whether that's ugly or not, that's sort of your perspective. It is, you know, in terms of what the priorities of the state are, it's not the expressed priorities of the management agencies of the state. I mean, their goal is to maintain as much of these rivers and streams in as good of condition as they possibly can. So, you know, that's kind of.
Well, I know there's been paintings, you know, scenarios of the future, and like the desert, there'd be nothing but plants that are thorny and are just really, you know, in these half rat, half kangaroo-like things. and that's what's going to be, that's the future. And that, you know, I don't say communicate that, but if you put a creature of the Black Lagoon into the scenario, you might scare some people and turn down the temperature.
What you'll end up with, the most likely scenario of what you'll end up with here is a situation where the public pressure of fishermen, which is a fairly influential political group, will promote more stocking. And so you will have to go out into these areas where you might have once caught native Guadalupe bass or native largemouth bass. You might have to go out and catch stocked fish. Some people don't care about that. Some people just want to go out and back their limit, and that's what they're there for. But I think that there is a growing constituency, even within that group, that, you know, sees the value for this sort of resource in this sort of condition. Now, whether or not that overlaps with, you know, the group to the far left of you know, the alarmed and concerned, I couldn't tell you, but it is a growing concern in the fishing community.
Traditionally, probably the other side. Actually.
Yeah, traditionally it's probably more the other side.
In general, what is the effect of climate change or higher temperatures on the benthic fish in terms of the bottom waters? Will there be less oxygen there? And you mentioned the North Sea migrating further north for the benthic fish, and then you mentioned Iceland, the two different populations that I assume were, one was on the shelf and one migrated to the vertical column. How is that interbreeding between different populations and so forth affected by what's happening in the bottom waters in terms of, say, dissolved oxygen for their life cycle?
The waters up in Iceland are fairly well mixed to fairly good depth, so you don't tend to see sort of the oxygen minimum layer and the low DO waters tend to be very deep. And so these fish are not really experiencing those conditions. I don't think that those are expected to increase. Where this might start having an issue is that the work that we did suggests that, for the most part, even though there's not really a good genetic differentiation between the two behavioral types in each population, the data that we have suggests that they are spawning at different depths, that they segregate during the spawning season by depths. They're on the same general area during spawning at the same time, but when they're there and they're actively spawning, they're doing so at different depths. Now, with an increase in water temperature, there's a whole body of research out there. When cod are carrying eggs, it represents a very heavy metabolic load for them, and female cods require a lot more oxygen at the time when they're carrying eggs. It's a very heavy oxygen demanding tissue that they have when they're producing eggs. And as such, they tend to, the work that I've seen suggests that they look for cooler water, which tends to be deeper in these situations. And that might put it into a situation where currently we have this segregation, where you might start seeing a greater amount of overlap and breakdown of this population structure.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. Thank you, everybody.